Ladies and gentlemen, good day and welcome to the webinar for Rethinking Indian Private Equity Exits conference call, hosted by Nishith Desai Associates. As a reminder, all participant lines will be in the listen-only mode, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions after the presentation concludes. Should you need assistance during the conference call, please signal an operator by pressing star then 0 on your touch-tone phone. Please note that this conference is being recorded. I now hand the conference over to Mr. Nishchil Joshipura. Thank you and over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning to all the participants joining from India. Good afternoon to the participants from Singapore, Hong Kong and Japan. And good evening to the participants joining from US. Welcome to our webinar on Rethinking Indian Private Equity Exits. The timing for this webinar couldn't have been better, with the Indian government just yesterday evening approving direct listing of Indian shares on foreign exchanges without going through the ADR GDR route. What we plan to cover in this session are 3 or 4 structures that we have used for our private equity clients for achieving exits at better valuations. So we intend to cover the ADR GDR structure, which has traditionally been used by Indian companies since 1993. The second structure that we intend to cover is direct listing of Indian company shares on foreign exchanges, which is still in a proposal form, but nevertheless we'll discuss some of the nuances. The third structure, which is becoming very popular, is the US PAC structure, where number of US PACs are being set up for making acquisitions of businesses in India and China. And the fourth structure we are going to talk about is on flips and externalization, on how to externalize an Indian company and achieve better valuations. Before I deep dive into the topic along with the other panel members, I wanted to introduce our panelist. To my right is Rajiv Khanna. Rajiv is a shareholder and a partner of Buchanan Ingersoll, a top US law firm. And he has a CV which any lawyer would typically dream of. He became an equity partner, when he was just 3.5 years in the profession. He is considered as one of the New York super lawyer and has to his credit some of the most innovative transactions which he conceptualized and implemented. To my left is Simone Rees. She co-heads our M&A and corporate governance practice and has been involved in number of deals both in M&A and private equity space where she has worked on some of the structures. And to my extreme left is Abhinav. He is a senior member in the M&A and private equity team. Now the first question which typically comes up from Indian promoters is, why should we look abroad when we have Indian capital markets where we can list shares of our companies? So what has happened is, if you see this decade from 2011 to 2020, the first half of the decade got washed away because of the global financial crisis, where there were hardly any IPOs that happened on the Indian markets. And the second half, which is 2016 to 2020, is more of a recovery for Indian capital markets. So we haven't seen any significant IPO which one can boast of compared to the IPOs which have happened in other jurisdictions. And this is precisely the reason why number of Indian promoters and private equity players want to look abroad and see whether they can use any of the 4 structures that we are going to discuss to access global capital. So some of the reasons what we have seen why accessing global markets is better than Indian market, and the first important reason is global branding. So as you know, Infosys and Wipro were one of the early companies which access global capital markets and derived huge benefits from global branding in the last 25 to 27 years since they got listed. The other important reason is the multiples which you get for the same business from Indian investors is different from the multiples you get from US investors. So what we have seen is the US investors at times offer better multiples for the same business than Indian investors. The third important reason why accessing global market is better is the valuations and the quality of investors. The quality of investor is very sophisticated in US compared to the investors that we get in India. And the most important reason why we have seen some of these structures being done by, especially by private equity players, is the tax exemption applicable to ADRs, GDRs, which is not applicable to equity shares. So we have been involved with all these four types of transactions which we are going to discuss, and have been able to structure exits which have not only resulted in tax exempt transfers for our private equity clients, but at the same time those transfers have happened at better valuations. So before we get into details on the circulars and how the US law works on each of these structures, I just wanted to briefly take you through the milestones with respect to the ADRs, GDRs, right from 1993 to 2020. So the first time the government of India introduced the concept of ADR, GDR in 1993, where Indian IT companies were allowed to list their foreign currency convertible bonds and ordinary shares on through ADRs, GDRs on foreign exchanges. Some of these ADRs, Wipro listed on NYSE, Infosys listed on Nasdaq, and some of the other ADRs on Silverline, Rediff, we were part of initially when some of these companies access the NYSE and Nasdaq. Then in 2005, the next milestone came, and the government of India came up with a rule that for Indian companies to list abroad, they first need to be listed in India. And that actually became a big dampener because from 2008 onwards, 2008, 2009 onwards, the global financial crisis struck all the companies, especially the Indian companies. And the Indian capital markets started plateauing, and which is where what became important was the next big milestone in 2014, where Sahu committee report came out and introduced the 2014 ADR GDR scheme, which repealed 1993 ADR GDR scheme. Now, there were many radical proposals in that 2014 ADR GDR scheme, ranging from allowing unsponsored ADRs, GDRs to allowing unlisted securities also to be considered as permissible securities for issuing ADRs, GDRs. Then in 2018, what happened was there was another committee that was set up, because what the government realized is that the ADR, GDR route is not being used to the extent they wanted it to be. So government set up a committee to explore whether shares of an Indian company can be directly listed on overseas exchanges. And the report is finally going to be implemented in 2020. And as I mentioned, the news just came yesterday that government is amending the Companies Act to allow shares of an Indian company to be listed on foreign exchanges. One more major milestone was in October 2019, where SEBI came out with a circular to operationalize the 2014 circular partly. And that's something that we'll discuss in detail with the panel. Now, going into each of these topics, my first question is to Simon. Simon, the 2019 circular of SEBI was something that was much awaited uh, to operationalize the 2014 ADR GDR scheme. Can you throw some light on the circular?
Sure. Thanks, Nishith, for that introduction. And I think you've covered the history behind the DR's issuances really well. Just to go back and give our audience a little context, in terms of the 2019 circular that has come out by SEBI, and in light of the 2014 regulations for DRs. Like you said, the 2014 regulations were broad. They were quite exciting because for the first time, I think unlisted companies as well as listed companies were really on a similar or a level playing field, where both could access foreign capital in similar ways. Secondly, with respect to sponsored and unsponsored ADRs, GDRs, I think that was extremely exciting because previously you always required the assistance of the Indian issuer to actually try and list your securities or issue DRs overseas. In this situation, in 2014, the regulations actually do mention that a set of security holders could actually, without the interference or without the assistance of the Indian company, transfer their securities and get them to be DRs and access the capital markets overseas. But in 2019, SEBI came out with a circular in October 2019. SEBI came out with a circular, stating what it meant for listed companies to actually issue DRs to the public. So quickly, one is with respect to a listed company, there has to be some basic eligibility criteria. These eligibility criteria are very similar to IPO requirements. You can't really be debarred from accessing capital markets. You can't really be economic fugitive. So basic criteria for directors, selling shareholders, promoters, the listed company. The criteria are slightly more enhanced for a listed company doing a fresh issuance as opposed to just a mere secondary transfer by selling shareholders. But these are basic criteria that need to be met by the listed company. The second issue is that it has to be listed on in permissible jurisdictions and on international exchanges that are permitted by SEBI. Now, we're still awaiting the final list of what that would be because this is something that SEBI will announce or has the ability to determine from time to time. So a finite list of that is still awaited. The third sort of criteria is that the DRs today can be only issued on the back of permissible securities, and whilst in the 2014 regulations, permissible securities was a very vast, broad set of securities. Under the SEBI circular 2019 circular limits this to equity shares that are listed and debt securities that are listed. The next sort of criteria is with respect to voting rights. Now, previously, especially for listed companies, there was always an issue as to whether DRs carried voting rights or not. And it has a lot to play where public shareholding is concerned. As we all know, listed companies need to maintain a specific a specific sort of shareholding, public shareholding in the market. So whether this constitutes public shareholding or not, that was one criteria. And more importantly, is that under our takeover code, whenever you acquire voting securities, there are obligations that could be attracted, depending on the voting ability that you have in an Indian company. And therefore, very often, what did happen was either the DRs did not have any voting rights, or the depository sort of exercised them independent of the DR holders. But now the 2019 circular does talk about voting rights that have to be given to the DR holder, and the custodian and depository need to exercise these on the instruction of the DR holder. So therefore, consequently, takeover core obligations become important, as well as if you look at the 2014 regulations read with the 2019 circular, any sort of DRs that have voting rights will be constituted. That equity share block will be constituted or will be counted for the public shareholding in the Indian listed company. And I think these basically are the key sort of criteria, Nishal, on the 2014 and 2019 sort of read with the 2019 circular. But I suppose what we do want clarity on and therefore I think the DR issuances has been a little bit hasn't really been used to the extent that it could have been used. Was because the intricacies of how for shareholders would transfer, whether and how this entire mechanics would actually work, were awaited. Now, two or three sort of criteria that people ask. One is, are there any restrictions on who can actually purchase these DRs? And that is clear under the Foreign Exchange and Management Act. Only persons resident outside India are allowed to actually purchase these DRs. That continues to be the case even in through the 2019 circular, and it is clarified there that the DR holder cannot be an Indian resident. The DR holder cannot be a non-resident Indian. So these sort of two subsects of people are not allowed to purchase these DRs. The second sort of question is, must they be listed on a foreign exchange? And the answer to that is also yes. A listed company issuing DRs have to have those DRs listed on a foreign exchange. This is what the 2019 circular actually states. We can sort of go back and forth on the 2014 versus 2019, but in a nutshell, the 2019 circular deals with listed companies. It gives sort of clarity on how this will work for listed companies. We're still awaiting, certain criteria. But again, given the fact that the central government has now, has approved direct direct listing of equity shares of an Indian company on foreign exchanges. The question mark will still be raised as to whether the DR route would be the preferred route or should it be equity shares. And really, is there a difference between the two, save and except maybe certain clear tax provisions that currently exist in today's law?
Thank you, Simon. Uh, Rajiv, you have been involved in multiple ADR transactions. We would love to hear from you on your experience in dealing with some of these transactions.
Well, the area transaction. Well, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I did want to mention that my relationship with your firm goes back way back to '85. Hopefully, you were born then. And out of the five seminal transactions which I've done, which are considered path breaking, two were in partnership with your firm. So I'm very glad to be here. I have over the years been disappointed at the lack of ADRs in the US and never clearly understood why Indian companies have not accessed that route a little more. Uh, for example, if you look on the pharma side, there's Dr. Reddy's, and then there's what? Nothing. You look on tech side, there is Infosys, there's Wipro, and then what? Nothing. So, but there are a lot of fund managers in the US who would like to have Indian paper in their portfolio for themselves and for their clients. So if they are thinking of India, they are what, 10 ADR issues?
About 14, 15.
14, 15. They have a very limited choice.
Right.
And so if they're looking at pharma, they go for Dr. Reddy's. If they're looking at tech, they'll go for Infosys or Wipro. But by that process, those who are not listed depress their valuation because they don't get bought in the US, and they depress the investors that would they depress the value because the investors would like to invest in them, who don't necessarily want to come in as investors in India, who don't necessarily want to be awake at night and wonder what's happening in the Indian market, just don't invest in them. So the valuation continue to be depressed or not reaching their full potential. The ADR process is not as complicated as many people believe. I think listing processes in the US are catching on pretty much. In the India, have been catching on to par with the US processes. So it's not that much extra effort to list the ADRs out there. The reporting requirements for a foreign private issuer, which the Indian companies would be, is much less than Then for domestic US companies, they only need to file an annual report in 20F, and they need to file 6K, which is really a mirror image of what they file in India. So the area route is really a good way to enhance the valuation of your company, to access a whole big capital market. And it's really surprising that not too many companies have taken advantage of it. So we hope they'll take more advantage of it.
Yeah. In fact, that's a very good point that you have made. And this is what happens when there is a flip flop on the regulations on government side. So just to take that comparison forward, while there are about 14 Indian companies which have accessed NASDAQ NYSE for issuing ADRs, the number as far as Chinese companies is concerned is about 137. So almost 10 times more ADRs have been issued by Chinese companies compared to Indian companies. And if you take the regulations which were introduced in 1993 to 2020, it's almost 27 years and 14 ADRs. So on an average, it's just one ADR every 2 years. And that's not something which India should be proud about. And there's a lot of scope for improvement as far as Indian companies accessing the US markets is concerned. But Raju, I want you to touch upon some of the structures that you have seen for ADRs, GDRs, which can be helpful for some of the private equity investors who have invested in Indian companies.
Right. So, I mean, we just recently announced a transaction where it was a private company, still private, in India, which will do an ADR offering within the next 1 year. But based on that commitment, they have been able to get an equity line of $90 million. Now, suddenly, this company has become very attractive to everybody. This is a very good company, in my view, has a great product, but suffered from three great disasters over the last 2 years, including demonetization, GST, and the Chinese dumping. So suddenly, this great company with a great product was feeling a liquidity crunch. Now we got them an equity line based on the strength of their underlying business. Now suddenly, this company, which was having trouble raising money because it's a capital intensive company, and needs to raise money constantly to grow, as everybody. So the lenders are lining up because they believe they'll be paid out of the equity line. The underwriters are lining up to do their area offering because they believe that if they can get an equity line of $90 million, then the area offering is viable. Reverse mergers are lining up for them because suddenly they look viable. So, as I say, money attracts money. And because we were able to get them the first set of money, first vote of confidence on their underlying business, that they have suddenly become very viable. And this is a very good route for private equity players who have invested in companies in India, which may be going through a slightly rough patch because of some of the reasons I mentioned or other reasons, to rehab themselves. The difference between the US market and an Indian market is, in the Indian market, you sell on numbers, whether you're doing an IPO or whether you're selling your company. In the US market, you sell on the promise of your company. If the promise of your company is good, I mean, look at Uber, look at its
Yeah.
valuation. It hasn't made a dime in all the years it's been around. But look at the valuations. Look at Tesla. I think they made a dime of profit in all the years. Look at the big valuations. Even Facebook, when it came in, had hardly any revenues. Got a huge valuation. Is the promise of the company. The market value is the promise, the market value is the story. And I don't know of any other market that does it better than the US. Yes, there are some failures, but the market factors that in too. But that doesn't stop the market for valuing the promise of the company. So if there are companies that the PE investors are invested in which have promise, whether or not they are cash flow positive, whether or not they have profits, whether or not they have a liquidity crunch, if the promise, underlying promise is great, then the best route is to do an ADR, get an equity line, and that will money will attract money, debt will come in, PE investors can make a good exit, eventually the entrepreneurs can make a good exit, and everybody can go home happy.
Yeah. So two follow-up questions on
Sure.
that, Rajiv, and maybe initial. I think we're talking about DRs, and I think the tax treatment of a DR and how what the is very important. So we'll have that discussion. But Rajiv, just two follow-up questions. I think we did mention China has 137, we have just 14, 15. I think two set of questions that come to mind when we've been advising Indian companies to do DRs. One is, what is the cost of compliance for an Indian company doing a DR, and is it exhaustive? And second is in terms of size, right? Does size really matter? Does it have to be a large number for it to attract investors?
So let me answer the second question first. I don't think you can do an ADR offering effectively less than 50 million. 100 million is a good number. You remember you and I, and that was wasn't a seminal deal, but we worked together on the silver line, which was 100 million, and that was a good number. Then, and it still continues to be a good number today. So that's it. The cost of compliance is not that excessive because, like I said, unlike a US company which has to file quarterly reports, the Indian company, because it's a foreign private issuer, does not have to file quarterly reports. It has to file an annual report only. It's a 20F. And then it has to file whatever it files in the Indian exchanges, BSE and SE, with a wrap called 6K. So it's a form 6K says we declared XYZ on to Bombay Stock Exchange or to SEBI, and so we also filed that with SEC. It's not a huge cost of compliance, and it's been coming down as processes have got automated. But I mean, it's also I hear this a lot, but it's that what about the cost of compliance? That's like the tail wagging the dog. The cost of compliance compared to the huge multiple expansion in valuation, it's just peanuts. You keep looking at that cost of compliance and say, it's like saying, I will not go to office because I will have to pay for a taxi fare to go to office. It's that simple. I mean, how many of us get up in the morning and say, I'm not going to office today because I have to pay, drive my car, I've got to have a petrol, I have to take a train, I've got to take a taxi. So I will not go to office because that's the cost of commuting. So the cost of compliance is almost like a cost of commuting when you look at the multiple expansion, the valuation expansion that takes place when you go to a developed, mature, and deep market. I mean, I know Indian companies have gone to AIMS, they've gone to LSC. Those markets are not deep in their pockets. They don't have deep pockets. The only market that really has deep pockets continues to be the US market. So you don't go there, you shrink your valuation, you shrink your multiple. Maybe you're still happy. Maybe you've made more money than you ever dreamed you would, but that doesn't mean you made as much money as you should.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And Nishal, maybe you can just talk about the tax issues at a DR level. That will be really helpful.
Sure. So there are five types of transactions which would be relevant when it comes to ADR, GDR. The first one would be where an Indian company is issuing shares to a foreign depository, and in turn the foreign depository is issuing DRs to the investors. So that's a transaction where there is money going into the Indian company, and there is no tax on that transaction, and there is no transfer as such taking place as per the Income Tax Act. The second type of transaction is the secondary ADR transaction, where an existing private equity fund can transfer its shares to a foreign depository against which it can be issued the ADRs by the foreign depository. Now, this transaction is a taxable transaction, and the price at which the transfer takes place to the foreign depository, if it is more than the price at which the shares were acquired, there will be capital gains tax implications on the private equity investor, subject to availability of treaty benefits. So if the private equity fund had invested prior to, let's say, March 31st, 2017, and had come through Mauritius or Singapore or Netherlands, then there is a possibility that this transaction could be tax exempt as per those treaties. The third type of transaction is once the ADRs, GDRs have been held by the investor, any transfer of such ADR, GDR by that foreign investor to another non-resident of India is a tax exempt transaction under the Indian Income Tax Act. So there you don't even need to have a tax treaty, and there is a direct exemption available under the Income Tax Act. The fourth type of transaction which would be relevant is if any investor wants to convert the GDRs or ADRs into equity shares of the Indian company, and that is possible because there is dual fungibility which has been allowed, where shares can be converted into DRs and DRs can be converted into shares. So in this fourth type of transaction, when DRs are converted into shares, that again is considered as a taxable transaction under Income Tax Act, and there will be taxes that will have to be paid by the DR holder. The fifth type of transaction is once the DRs have been converted into shares and the PE fund wants to sell these shares, then depending on whether the transfer is a qualifies as a long-term transfer or a short-term transfer, long-term or short-term capital gains tax would be applicable. Now, why is this discussion important for the purpose of webinar? This is important because we have successfully structured some of the exits for PE funds, where the PE funds exited without paying any taxes to the Indian government and without even giving any tax indemnities or approaching the tax department for nil withholding orders. And the way we did this was the PE funds, what we did was PE funds who had invested prior to March 31st, 2017 in Indian companies, we transferred their shares to a foreign depository. And at that time, we took the benefit of the India, Mauritius or India Singapore tax treaty and avail of the capital gains tax exemption. And after 2 or 3 years, when the ADR valuation was very attractive, those PE funds transferred their ADRs to another US investor, which is a completely a tax exempt transaction under Income Tax Act. So when this transaction happened where the buyer was buying the ADRs from our PE client, at that time there was no discussion on tax indemnity or nil withholding order because there is a direct exemption under Income Tax Act and there was no need to rely on the tax treaty. So this is one of the main reasons why the PE fund should explore this route, because one is there are exemptions available not only under the treaty but also under the Income Tax Act, and it could turn out to be quite lucrative at the time of exit because you not only get a tax exempt exit but also better valuations when you are transferring your ADS.
That's really helpful.
So, Rajiv, I think the next important topic is on SPACs. And SPACs, for the knowledge of the audience, are special purpose acquisition companies, and these have become very popular, especially among US investors for acquiring Indian and Chinese businesses. Can you throw some light on the SPAC structures, how they work, and how it could be relevant for Indian companies acquisitions?
Sure. So the SPAC market, first to backtrack a little, the SPAC market in the US goes in circles. Sorry, cycles. So there are cycles when there are not enough SPACs in the US, and then there are cycles when there is a glut of SPACs in the US, the cycles when they're successful, and the cycles when they're not successful. So right now, the cycle is where there is a glut of SPACs in the US. So SPACs are formed by entrepreneurs, typically not typically, they're required to have no preconceived idea of who they're going to buy. And they have a limited amount of time within which they have to buy, otherwise they have to liquidate and give the money back to the investors. And the promoters of the SPAC, as they would be called in India, would lose their money. So as the deadline approaches, they get kind of more and more desperate. Um, Typically, in a SPAC structure, the target company would merge into into the SPAC. Now, that Mr. will probably tell you better than I can, for a variety of Indian reasons, has proved to be difficult to get approvals to get that done. So what we have done is, well, when we are advising clients on SPACs, we are saying you don't have to merge. The SPAC can invest 50.1 or whatever, 50 plus a little, one more share into the Indian company. What that does is it allows the SPAC to consolidate the results of the Indian company with with itself. It can invest more than 50.1, but it has to have a majority in order. Generally, there are other criteria, but generally the safest criteria is that the SPAC should have a majority in the Indian company. So it just does an FDI investment, invest into the Indian company, and it's a quick way to for the Indian company to go public. The existing promoters and shareholders of the Indian SPAC are given an option to convert their Indian shares into the SPAC shares in an exchange ratio when they like. And why is that important? Because if they convert at the right at the outset, then that would be a taxable event for them in India, because there's no tax-free exchange in India. So they do it right when they're about to make an exit. They convert, they pay the tax, which they would have to pay in India anyway. And since the value at which they convert is high enough, there's no tax in the US. So they pay one tax, which would have been paid by them anyway. So I would encourage the companies to look at SPACs. We would be happy to introduce them to SPACs. Happy to, of course, work through the process of a SPAC with the people. Of course, they're good SPACs, they're bad SPACs, they're SPACs where shareholders would or stockholders would vote yes and then also ask for a redemption. So effectively, you don't get what the money you thought you were going to get. So one of the criteria we put is we look at the SPAC, whether it's going to be heavy redemptions or not. And we also put in a minimum that if 50% of the money doesn't stay or 75% of the money doesn't stay, then the transaction is voided. So there are certain pitfalls that one needs to watch when you do a SPAC merger or merge with a SPAC. But overall, tends to be a very good source in the current market for Indian companies to get capital and get capital quickly, um, and get going. And particularly companies which are not may not be themselves in a position to go public themselves. The other thing to in a SPAC to notice is to keep in mind is that you should typically be three times in value of the SPAC. So the minimum SPACs that are going around are roughly 15 million. So your valuation as a company to be attractive to a SPAC should be $150 million. But if you meet that criteria, they're smaller SPACs, they may be a $30 million SPAC, $25 million SPAC. But typically, the minimum size SPAC is 50 million at least. The bigger SPAC, 100, 200, 300 million. So I would recommend for Indian companies with a valuation of $150 million to look at SPAC as a good way to get cash and get cash quickly.
No, thanks, Rajiv. In fact, just for our audience, majority of them are private equity funds. Uh, I think the SPAC model is in a way similar to a blind pool fund model
Right.
where the LPs give money to the GP and GP can pretty much decide on which deals to select and when to invest and when to exit. In a SPAC model also, it's also called a blank check company where the investors write the check for the SPAC, but they don't know which deal the SPAC is going to do. Whether it's, I think the only thing which is mentioned is the sector and the geography.
Yeah, but the
That all
investors get a right to vote on the
they get a right to vote
as
on that.
opposed to an
Absolutely.
LPGP blind pool where they don't.
Absolutely. So they get a right to vote once the target has been identified
Identified.
on whether they are comfortable with the founders going ahead with the acquisition from the SPAC or not. But just a question to you, Abhinav. Well, Rajiv talked about the US related issues on SPAC. Uh, we have also encountered issues with the Indian issues, especially from an exchange control and tax perspective on SPAC. Can you throw some light on that?
Sure. So I think Rajiv in his issues on the US side also touched upon the issues that we end up facing with our clients on the Indian side. The biggest issue that we end up facing is from an exchange control perspective, FEMA, something we all know as round tripping today. The Indian companies which are looking to go overseas generally have a large base of Indian investors or the promoters of the Indian company. And whenever we are looking at the SPAC model, the first question that comes in, and as I think Rajiv mentioned, the timing of when the flip happens for the Indian promoters or the investors from the Indian company to the SPAC is important. I'll come back to the tax aspect in a minute. But even from a FEMA perspective, RBI has always traditionally been uncomfortable with Indians investing abroad in companies which have follow on or investments downstream into India again. In fact, in last year, RBI's FAQ made this very, very clear, where they said that you can make investments in overseas JV or wholly owned subsidiaries only if under the approval route. So this is something which has always been a concern as to when the flip happens, how do you actually get the Indian promoters and investors shares in the offshore company? Uh, and we've encountered situations where if the shareholding is to be flipped at a later point for them, there is always this level of distrust or uncomfort. The investors are uncomfortable, be it at the offshore level or at the onshore level, with the two-tier structure, because at the end of the day, they are like, where do I have the direct control? Stuff like that comes in. So that's always been a challenge, which is more coming from FEMA, but it results in the entire structure being looked at a little more carefully. The other one, of course, is from a tax perspective. As Rajiv mentioned, if the Indian investors or, in fact, the non-resident investors flip into the offshore company's valuation at that point of time and the swap ratio that is agreed to or the exchange ratio, depending on that, the shares that are acquired by the investors are valued at that particular amount. Now, the promoters, for instance, would have invested at a very, very cheap valuation upfront, may have gone on to keep investing at time regular intervals, but overall the cost of acquisition for them would be very low. Now, when they are issued these instruments or the shares of the SPAC, the valuation of which is considered to be enormously high, there is a tax at that particular moment. And if it is an exchange ratio, it becomes more in the nature of a phantom tax, where you're not really getting any cash, while you are getting a step up, but you have to pay tax at that particular point of time, which is where I think what Rajiv was also mentioning, that immediately prior to the exit, you take benefit of the swap, you get the step up, and then you transfer it at that particular value to ensure at least your tax at one level. And the tax incidents arise at a time when you have actually cash from the ultimate transfer. So I think these two are the biggest issues that we keep facing in externalizing or in taking structures through a SPAC model from an Indian perspective.
So
And
I have a follow-up question. So how difficult is it to get that FEMA approval? I know you need a FEMA approval, but how difficult is it to get it?
So I think the FEMA approval is very subjective, and it is depending on how much of a substance do you actually have, and what is the rationale for you going to the SPAC model. I think it becomes more in the nature of how is the RBI looking at it, and do you have the bona fides for actually externalizing the structure, or are you doing it just for the sake of getting taking your structure offshore?
Right,
like as of now, RBI is not very open
Mhm.
to these type of structures
Mhm.
because the biggest concern is on money laundering. Their Indian shareholder owning shares in a foreign company and that foreign company again owning shares in an Indian company, and that's the only asset of the foreign company. So the first question which RBI asks is that why can't the Indian shareholder directly invest in Indian company? Now, then you have to explain to them that we need a listed entity and the markets are better abroad. But that level of sophistication is not yet there with RBI on some of these structures. And unfortunately, there have been one or two cases, not for SPACs, but in other situations where some of these structures were misused, and that's where there has been a lot of distrust from RBI side on implementing these structures, which result in round tripping.
Yeah, so therefore, I think, but the first objective, which is if you are a cash strapped company in India, and you need money, a SPAC is a good way to do it. Whether or not you will be able to flip it,
Correct.
hopefully you hope
Yeah.
you do the transaction
Someday.
in an anticipation that someday you'll be able to do it. And the worst case, you won't be able to do
Yeah.
it, but you still have a much stronger company
Absolutely.
in India financially. So
Absolutely. In fact, I think one more question, Abhinav, is traditionally, as Raju mentioned, one of the models for SPAC has been that the target company after acquisition merges with the SPAC, right? While there is another model where you can acquire more than 50%. But are there any issues in the first model? Because that would be an ideal model for a SPAC where, the entire business is also in the SPAC. But any thoughts on that?
So I think the issues remain similar: FEMA and tax, exchange
right,
control and tax. From an and outbound mergers, as we all know, were not traditionally permitted. They got permitted under the 2013 Act. Gradually, over a period of time, the provisions were notified. The RBI came out with the regulations for cross-border mergers, be it inbound or outbound. Uh, the issues that we end up facing with outbound mergers are more from a FEMA compliance perspective. The RBI regulation, which has permitted outbound mergers, state that you have to comply with ODI regulations. Now, that's, I think, the first issue that you end up facing, which is similar to what we have in a SPAC model, where if you have an Indian shareholder to the Indian company, then compliance with ODI again goes back to the question of compliance with round tripping if there are any further subsidiaries of the Indian merging entity. That's one. The second is, of course, if it's a regulated sector in India, it becomes all the more difficult because you have sectoral regulators, and a lot of the regulators are not comfortable with the business being conducted offshore without an Indian entity. Uh, the third one is that there are restrictions on the kind of Indian liability, be it in terms of rupee loan guarantees that the foreign entity may have, and there is a time period that has been given to foreign companies post the merger to wind down those liabilities. So that becomes a third concern on how exactly do you go ahead with it. And I think another one is that you are not permitted to hold assets which you were not allowed as a foreign company. So we've seen situations where Indian companies which have substantial immovable property are facing issues on merging because that would mean liquidating those immovable properties for the overall company. And of course, finally, the fact that you need the approval of the NCLT, which is a time consuming process. And with the number of contingencies in the entire situation, it's something that needs to be factored in.
And I think one more point, Abhinav, is if you do that merger, how does that foreign entity conduct business in India
right,
without a presence? And then you have whether it can be a branch office, which has limitations under our regulations. It has perverse tax consequences under our regulations. So economically and legally, it becomes a little challenging for
Yeah.
a merger to occur and
Yeah.
continue to do business
So,
in
in
India.
fact, just for the benefit of audience, while inbound mergers are tax exempt as per Indian Income Tax Act, so a foreign company merging with an Indian company, there is a tax exemption available under the Indian Income Tax Act. But there is no tax exemption available for an
right,
Indian company merging with a foreign company. And because there is no tax exemption available, it could be deemed as a transfer of assets by Indian company to the foreign company, which could be taxed as per the Indian Income Tax Act. And this is also one of the reason why outbound mergers, in addition to the other regulatory reasons which you mentioned, have not been popular in India. So,
so
Rajiv, you wanted to say something?
so I mean, you gave so many good reasons. So, but for the audience, which is most of them are not lawyers, I guess, is it fair to include that at the present moment, given all the issues we mentioned, the traditional SPAC model, where the target just merges
Mergers.
into the SPAC, is not a viable option for an
Correct.
Indian
That's
company,
correct.
Absolutely.
and the only model for a SPAC to be used by Indian company is the SPAC investing into the Indian
More than
company,
50.
which would inject liquidity,
Yeah.
whether it'll give to the Indian company, whether it'll get eventually, and one would hope would eventually give liquidity to the promoters and investors
Yeah.
in India, and they're eventually allowed to transfer. But the first objective is met, that you need money.
Right.
Yeah.
I did want to also mention that one of the reasons why these structures should be looked at is because at the moment there is a liquidity crunch coming into India. It's not fully set in, but it's coming. One, because banks have stopped lending and
Yeah.
Mr. will tell you why. And two, the returns in the US and in other places are relatively getting better to the returns in India. So private equity, while this year is still coming, I'm not sure it's coming next year unless things change. And the returns in India get better, which are not like is also not likely to happen. So that is why we need to rethink this whole issue about how else do you get liquidity to the companies, because even good companies can just fail if there's not liquidity. Like the company I was mentioning was a great company, is a great company, but if you don't give it money, it'll fail. It's like it needs. Some of the companies are very capital intensive and have to be constantly you have to get ahead, have to be constantly capital intensive. Am I right?
Yeah,
So you want to
absolutely.
mention a little bit about what the liquidity crunch is, or because of
Yeah,
the banks?
absolutely. Yeah. I think
Although surprisingly, Nishchal, 2018 actually was the best exit. 2018,
yeah.
2019 seemed to have been the best exit scenarios for Indian, not because of the IPO markets, just because there were really large
Yeah, I
buyouts.
think
And
Right.
lot of secondary exits happened where P to P and P to
Yeah.
strategic happened in 2018. But I would say that was more because for the previous 4 5 years there
Nothing
was
had
no
have been
exit,
happened.
and it
correct.
all accumulated in 2018
Yeah.
Mm.
and 2019. But just to answer Rajiv's question, as we all know, the liquidity crunch is a result of various moves, including demonetization, the introduction of GST, the NBFC crisis. On account of which the banks have started stop lending to the NBFCs, and in turn NBFCs have stopped lending to the businesses. So clearly the sources of capital are drying up, and which is where the SPAC model could turn out to be a good alternative for some of the Indian cash trap companies, where without any significant compliances you can get the money, and at the same time get the global branding that one of your controlling investors is a listed company, is a listed SPAC in the US. So definitely I think it's a good time for Indian companies to explore the SPAC model.
Yeah, one of the things also that happens in these transactions is typically the stack takes over the name of the company. So now you get global branding because to an ordinary person, XYZ company in India has the same name as a listed company in the US. So they automatically assume it's listed in the US, although the reality may be that the US company is just a controlling parent
Yeah.
of the Indian company. So it's you're right. The
Yeah,
global
that's
branding is huge.
yeah. So maybe moving on to the next question. So we have already covered the listing through ADR GDR model, direct listing without ADR GDR model, and the SPAC model. Let's move to the fourth model on flips or externalization, where we have successfully flipped some of the Indian companies abroad, in a legally compliant and a tax efficient manner. So would you like to share your thoughts on that, Simon?
Sure, Nishal. In today's environment, whether a flip is really still required or not, honestly depends on how well our law is drafted and how well the central government issues, the new regulations for listing equity directly. But historically, what for the reasons we've discussed, better valuations, better markets, just the foresight of doing an IPO, and not having so many hiccups with respect to market uncertainty, and just opening your umbrella, opening the horizon of markets that you could access. People wanted to have companies or holding companies where all shareholders were gathered outside the country. To achieve that, when an Indian business is already sort of generating revenue and is already started off, how do you do that? How do you sort of flip? And a flip really means that the shareholding of the in the Indian company is flipped to to a foreign company, and that foreign company holds all of the equity shares, or as much as it can, in the Indian company, right? Questions that are consistently raised is, one is, how do you sort of transfer business? How do you transfer shares? So the typical model in a nutshell was, a new co was set up in an offshore jurisdiction. That new co sort of set up an Indian company. the Indian company acquired the business of the existing Indian company, and the existing shareholders started off the holdco company, which in fact put money into India, and and the Indian company, new Indian company, acquired the business of the old Indian company. But previously, I think pre 2017, this was far simpler for the following reasons. One is under the Indian law and regulations prior to 2017, Indian shareholders could also invest through the LRS route in entities outside India that had investments in India, and there was no restriction on the LRS route being used for such investments. So therefore, in a company that had majority shareholders that were foreign and minority promoter shareholders, it perhaps was a simpler route to do because the Indian promoter could also have some stake in the offshore company. Today that becomes and I think secondly is that most foreign investors really had treaty protections, and therefore transferring shares really didn't induce too much capital gains tax, and therefore there was an ability to sort of invest, and the Indian shares that were held by the foreign shareholders could be sold off, or just the company could be liquidated simpler. Today, it becomes a little bit of a sort of question mark, really, as to how the Indian promoter, the Indian shareholder, would actually be given a pie of the foreign company if you want to do this. Even historically, there are two criteria that need to be looked at, and every company really can't really go in for an externalization. One is it depends on whether you're an asset light or an asset heavy company, because the business transfer otherwise would be quite a expensive ordeal with stamp duty and other criteria that need to be taken into consideration. Second is with respect to at what point in time is this business being flipped? Is it at a nascent stage? Is it, are you, have you conducted business for a long time? Again, all evaluation criterias, because the new holding company and the new Indian company, really it will be, the holding company would perhaps be thinly capitalized. The Indian company also might be thinly capitalized, and the business really is purchased at perhaps book value. So it really depends on at what stage you are really coming in. So the flip structure was not a cookie cutter for all transactions. It depends on company to company. But in today's situation, it's not like a flip can't be done, and it's not like Indian shareholders are not allowed to get sort of economic stake in the offshore company. And the way it's typically done is that yes, the new holding company may not hold 100% of the Indian company. A small sliver continues to be held by the Indian promoters or Indian investors that can't really have investments in the foreign company, but they have rights and perhaps an economic holding in the offshore company, like a phantom share that is taken into consideration for to determine voting rights, to determine affirmative rights, to determine fully diluted basis. Or you don't necessarily put in money offshore, but you capture it through a reference shareholding or a phantom share overseas. And when the final exit does really happen, when the holding company or the offshore holding company goes in for a IPO or a listing overseas, what then happens is that the Indian shareholder would have a put option, or the holding company has a call option to purchase the shares held by the Indian shareholders, and the proceeds of that call option put option are sourced through an initial public offering, and at the time of the IPO. So all in all, what does happen at the end is that all shareholders are entitled to exit. The Indian shareholders get an exit by the holding company buying them out, and the holding company and the shareholders at the holding company level are entitled to sort of get their shares listed on the offshore exchange. Whether that need continues to arise today, like I said, it depends on really how we see the Indian laws morphing. Because if you can achieve perhaps listing offshores of direct equity, you may not necessarily need the flip structure.
Understood.
I got two follow-up questions for you. One is, given that the book value of a lot of Indian businesses right now is pretty depressed, uh, for companies where the book value is depressed, isn't it easier to flip the structure because you have less of tax incident?
Well, yes and no, and I think we have new regulations on how book value has to be determined, which didn't
Okay.
exist prior to 2017, and maybe
Yeah,
Nishal, you would
I
like
think
to,
the main
yeah.
issue, Rajiv, is prior to 31st March 2017, we didn't have the concept of general anti-avoidance rules,
Mm.
which means the concept was more of form over substance,
Right.
where you can transfer an asset at book value and tax department cannot question under any section of the Income Tax Act.
Right. No, but if you get a
But
fair
post,
valuation done.
yeah, post 1st April 2017, what has happened is there is a very wide-ranging provision on general anti-avoidance rule, which pretty much gives all powers to tax department to question any transaction which they believe is not at an arm's length. Now, the question which comes up is, let's say if you are doing a transaction where you are transferring some asset at book value, but let's say in the same company there is some round which has happened from the investor 3 months or 6 months back
Oh yeah,
at
then you have a
3x,
problem.
4x valuation, then it's
That's a
not
problem.
possible to prove that this is happening at arm's length. So while it has gotten more difficult to do flips in India because of this general anti-evidence rules, I think what can still be done, as Simon rightly mentioned, as if the company is at a very nascent stage, right, where the valuations are generally depressed and not just the book value. It is still possible to do the flip and get yourself, get the entire shareholding mirrored in a, let's say, a Singapore company, and then the Singapore company holds an Indian company. One of the other reasons also why we have seen some of the international investors being comfortable investing in a Singapore company versus an Indian company is also enforceability of contracts,
Right.
right? It is easy to enforce a contract in Singapore versus India. Like in India, the questions may come up on whether the board can reject a transfer. Versus in Singapore, the laws are very clear on in what situation the board can reject a transfer, when a put option can be enforced. So some of the flip flops which happen under the Indian regulatory environment on put options, drags, tags, right of first refusals. You don't face those issues in some of the sophisticated jurisdictions like Singapore. So that's also one
Yeah.
more reason why
And
externalization of flips have become popular.
yeah, and also if you are truly a global company, right, and most flips are really, we sort of would advocate a flip if, for instance, the holding company could actually establish its own substance and perhaps have foreign customers, or you want to
Right.
expand globally and you have substance in that jurisdiction. So cash is also revenue is also earned by the holding company as opposed to it just being the Indian company. I mean that makes for a fantastic story for a flip. Repatriation of cash becomes also simpler because under Indian norms, first and foremost, there are limited instruments through which a foreign investor can invest in. You only have, equity shares. You have compulsory convertible equity shares. In a Singapore company and an offshore company, you can do optionally convertible debentures, so and so on and so forth. So repatriation of cash also becomes simpler, especially if there are revenues being generated offshore. That becomes a easier way to take money out.
So that I understand it in lay terms. So if there is the value of the company is truly depressed right now for whatever reason, which a lot of Indian companies
Companies
are,
have, yeah,
and there hasn't been a recent round which would
yeah,
contradict that, then you could do that,
you could
right?
do
You
that.
could do that.
Absolutely.
That's correct. You could do
It
it.
would be a good reason to do that.
Yes.
You
Also,
could do
I
it.
would mention that also all these ECB guidelines on debt are a big drag on the Indian companies. I mean, this is the absurdity of the Indian regulator.
Yeah.
They want Mr. Tada and the little guy who has no business to borrow exactly at the same interest rate. It
Right.
makes no sense, right? They have different credit profiles. Why would a lender lend at the same interest rate?
Yeah.
Or,
Correct.
right. Such is the wisdom of the Indian regulators. Um, so that
Absolutely.
I found is a big reason why people want to actually flip the structure, go
Yeah.
to a Singapore company. The other question I had was, remember a while back there was this company called Amira Foods, which
Yeah.
has not done well in the
Yeah.
stock market, but they did come with
The
up
rice
with
company, right?
the rice company. Yeah, they came up with a structure where they set up a BVI company. A BVI company set up a Mauritius company, and Mauritius company then had a contract to buy stock of the Indian company as soon as the BVI company went public, and the money just flowed down. So, is that structure still viable, or is that structure under the new regulations not viable?
That
That is,
structure is still
yeah,
viable.
that structure is
So that's
viable.
another way to flip it, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct.
So, I mean,
Yeah,
the promoter at the top takes some stock and then has a right to flip at any
that's
time.
correct. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So
So
it really
there are
depends.
this,
Yeah,
even with all the regulations, the flips are still very common.
Absolutely.
Not
absolutely.
common, but can be done.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, and
Viable.
absolutely. It depends on what stage you are at. If, for
Yeah.
instance, it's a new company that has only Indian investors today, and they're looking at maybe foreign investors in a large scale fundraising, instead of having the foreign investors invest into the Indian company directly, you have a large dilution that happens at the offshore level through a holding company. We've
Right.
seen that happen as well.
Yeah. So I think to summarize on this point, two or three important things for flips is one is the valuation should be depressed when you are doing the flip.
No recent round.
No recent round. And other important thing is the more non-resident shareholders you have in that company, it is easier to flip because then you are not worried about phantom tax for Indian shareholders. How will they acquire shares in a foreign company? And some of the round tripping issues which Abhinav mentioned. So broadly, this 2-3 fact patterns, if we can check the box on, then flip is something that can still be implemented in today's environment. So great. I think we have covered all the four models for overseas listing. Maybe before we open the floor for questions, Rajiv, any concluding remarks from your side?
No, I think this is great. I think, like I said, with the liquidity crunch coming, we have to look at innovative structures for Indian companies to make proper exits. So,
Sure.
with that, let's leave the time for questions.
Sure.
Hopefully, there are a lot of
Yeah.
questions.
Can we take the questions?
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. Anyone who wishes to ask a question may press star and one on their touchtone telephone. If you wish to remove yourself from the question queue, you may press star and two. Participants are requested to use handsets while asking a question. Ladies and gentlemen, we will wait for a moment while the question queue assembles. The first question is from the line of Anupam Agarwal from Vikasa Capital. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My question is to Rajiv. Rajiv, we talk about different possibilities for Indian companies to raise fund, let's say through ADR. Are there any negative set of sectors where US investors may not be very interested in investing for Indian companies?
No, I don't know of any. I think when I talk to fund managers in the US, and the problem in India is that people think that everybody is here in India, but actually, only I would say less than 1% of the fund managers are in India from the US, and they are constantly complaining that they like to have a portfolio investment in India in different sectors, variety of sectors, but there's not enough paper that's available on the New York Stock Exchange or Nasdaq for them to buy it. They don't want to invest into the Indian company and then wake up in the morning, especially with these kinds of market volatility. We say, "Oh, by the way, the stock I bought has gone down 40% while I slept." So they want to be there looking at the paper during their trading day, and they're just 14 scripts is just not enough of a choice. I mean, what do you choose from? If you want to go to pharma, you go to doctorates. If you want to go to tech, you got two companies. Every sector has one, two is the maximum. That's not enough choice for them. So there's a frustration from fund managers in the US on the lack of Indian paper available on Nasdaq and NYSE, and that is why that is the case. Beats me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. A reminder to the participants, anyone who wishes to ask a question, please press star one now. The next question is from the line of Caliph from Nishith Desai Associates. Please go ahead.
Nishith Vegas. Yeah. Hi Rajiv, how are you? Nishith here.
Hi Nishith, how are you?
Good. Sorry, because of some conflict, I couldn't be personally present.
No problem.
But your exposition was excellent, and I think For private equity, exit is the beginning, and today we could discuss many options to find solutions. And it's been always wonderful working with you. Of course, New York office and Palo Alto office in California both are in touch with you. I know that. But there are so many different ways in which we can find solutions to the Indian companies, which would like to find some liquidity for the investors, for the founders, and other things. And some of the things that we discussed today were very relevant. So I don't want to ask the question, but I just wanted to thank you for making your time here. And, and I think this is good for India, this is good for the US. I think at this point in time, India, even though the growth rate is a little down, there is some story, and there is a positioning. In every situation, there are always some, kind of spots which you can really leverage on. And when they said there is also opportunity, and I think if we sit together, a lot of other solutions can be found. But I think this was very useful, and I don't want to take too much time of the audience, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nishith. When I look around your office and the big empire you built out of I'm reminded about our friendship from '85 when we were both young lawyers. But there's one more structure that I think private equity should think of, and we've implemented it. It wasn't discussed, so maybe I'll take a minute to discuss it. We had a company in India, which was a client of mine, and it had an Indian PE investor. And the Indian PE investor was, this was about 2 years back, he was having tough time doing an exit in the Indian market. So what we did was we found them a US PE investor who was, because the product was that they had developed was pretty global, wanted to invest, do it, but they didn't want to invest into the Indian company. So what we did, we formed a Delaware company. The USP investor came in through the Delaware company, invested into the Indian company, and gave an option to the Indian shareholders to convert into the Delaware company stock, including the PE. And at this point, they did get all the FEMA approvals, whatever they are. And I've actually met on this trip the PE fund, and they have made a complete exit. As if the founders have made a complete exit. It took 2 years for them to make the complete exit after the initial investment by the USP investor. But they're both very happy. They made complete exit and at a great valuation. So even outside the role of public markets, even in private markets, the structure is very viable.
Yeah.
But thanks again for having me here.
No, I think it's been wonderful. In fact, one important thing to understand is you don't have to be $1 billion company.
Right.
Just to, there's opportunity for as small as 50 million. We have done some of those on NASDAQ and other transactions. But about 100 million, I think it creates a good opportunity for Indian companies, which are, even though they are not too big, they are very exciting and they are very interesting companies, especially the new age or new technology companies as well. As you rightly say, that it's a story, and they are very interesting stories to tell. So I think creating more exit opportunities, as we discussed today, is very helpful, and once again, I think good lessons to learn.
Yeah, in fact, the case I just mentioned, the initial investment by the USPE fund was only 10 million, and the valuation of the company was only was sub 50 million. So you're right. Smaller companies could do these exits too, but it was a company which had developed a great software product and was very likely.
Tell you one question I did not ask you about, ability to delist. I think that's another concern sometimes people have. If you can just make a little comment.
Yeah,
delisting.
delisting in the US is pretty simple.
I know. I know. That's why that's very important.
Right. Why you would delist, I don't know. But if you did want to delist, normally companies frankly do get delisted because when the valuation falls dramatically in Nasdaq say below $1. So, but if you really did want to delist, it's not like India, where I don't know about India, so let me not criticize India. But not like some jurisdictions where it's hard to delist. It's a pretty voluntary act, and you can delist.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nishit, for your question. Do we have any other questions from the participants?
Yes, sir. We have one participant in the queue.
Sure, please go ahead.
The next question is from the line of Rajarshi Ghosh from Indian Chambers of Commerce. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to know about exit routes for private equity for startups prior to IPO stage.
Yeah, so I think some of the exit routes which we mentioned, especially the last one on flips or externalization, that is something which is apt for a startup because, as we mentioned, there are two or three criteria which we should typically look at. That the valuations are low, which would be the case in case of a startup,
Right.
and depending on the shareholding of the startup, if the shareholding has a majority of non-resident investor, then it works out to be much better because they get the TT benefits. Depending on whether they had invested prior to 2017 or after 2017. Ideal candidate for an externalization or a flip would be a startup rather than a company which has already reached the growth stage and valuations have built up. And then it is difficult to transfer that company or externalize that company without any Indian capital gains tax implications. Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
question.
As there are no further questions, I would now like to hand the conference over to Mr. Nishchal Joshipura for closing comments.
So thank you to all the participants for joining this webinar. We hope that we have added some value to you know to the time that you have devoted this morning by attending this webinar. And there are lots of exciting things which we are expecting, especially on the direct listing of Indian shares on foreign exchanges from the government. But as we always say, devil lies in details, and we'll have to see in what form and shape the government introduces some of the changes to various laws, including the securities laws, the action control regulations, and the tax laws. And unless the laws are appropriately amended to make this product viable, the fear is that it could meet the same fate as ADR, GDR in terms of the 2014 scheme, where nothing happened for 5 years till SEBI came out with the circular in 2019. So, broadly, it's a wait and watch. Let's see how things shape up. But as Rajiv mentioned, time is ripe for the government to act fast because a lot of these Indian companies which are cash strapped can access some of these global markets through the four structures that we discussed. Uh, Thank you once again to all of you for joining this webinar.
So the one thought I have is even if direct listing is not allowed, you can still do a simultaneous IPO and do it, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, one role we lawyers have is to find ways to frustrate. Just as the government finds ways to frustrate the investors, we should find ways to frustrate the government. For example, in the recent transaction we did, and I racked my brain for 4 months. We had two of the toughest regulators, SEBI and SEC, blocking the equity line transaction. And finally, we came up with a structure where we could tell they off because this was really a U.S. securities, and we were able to tell SEC that you can't regulate to the full extent because the underlying security is really an Indian security. So we will try to keep finding creative ways
Sure.
to help our clients and our audience.
Absolutely. So with that, we'll close the webinar. And once again, thanks to all the participants for joining this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.